He had lived a life that few could even imagine. The world had seen him as a soldier, a warrior trained for missions that most people would never understand. He had faced danger in its rawest form, seen the darkest sides of humanity, and survived situations that could break anyone else. But now, after years of service in one of the most elite units in the military, he had left all that behind. He wanted a life that was quiet and simple, a life that allowed him to breathe without fear. He moved to a small town that hugged the edge of a forest, a place where the trees were thick and the streets were empty enough to feel safe. The town had its own rhythm, slow and steady, and he found comfort in the predictability of it. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who went on long walks and kept to himself. They didn't know about the missions that had shaped him, or the skills he carried silently in his mind and body. To them, he was just another man who enjoyed the calm of the countryside. The one thing that had stayed with him through every deployment, every battle, and every dangerous mission was his dog. The dog was more than a companion. It was a friend, a family, and a constant source of comfort. He had brought the dog home after his last deployment, when the chaos of the world had started to weigh too heavily on him. The dog was trained, loyal, and intelligent. It knew the difference between danger and play, between threat and safety. In the quiet hours of the night, the dog would curl up beside him, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Mornings in his new life were calm. He would wake up early, the sun just beginning to peek over the hills. The dog would already be waiting by the door, tail wagging, ready to start the day. They would walk along the edge of the forest, the crisp air filling his lungs and washing away the memories that sometimes surfaced too quickly. He enjoyed the simplicity of these moments, the rhythm of footsteps on dirt paths, the soft rustling of leaves. It was a life that demanded nothing more than presence, a life that reminded him of what it meant to live without the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He had taken up small routines that gave him purpose without the chaos of his past. He tended a small garden behind his house, grew vegetables that he could eat and share with neighbors. He learned to fix things around the house, to cook meals that were more about comfort than presentation. The dog was always there, watching, learning, and keeping him company. In a world that had been filled with danger and loss, this little patch of peace was sacred. The town was quiet, but it was not without life. People passed each other with nods and polite smiles. Children played in yards, their laughter ringing out like music. The man would sometimes watch them from his porch, a faint smile on his face, thinking about the family he had never had and the choices that had led him here. He felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of sacrifices made for a country that had moved on without him. But then he looked down at his dog, who was wagging its tail as if nothing else mattered, and he remembered that there was still something worth living for. The dog was protective, but in a calm, measured way. It was always alert, always aware, but never unnecessarily aggressive. It had been trained to follow commands, to respond to his instincts, and to keep him safe. He trusted the dog with his life, just as it trusted him without question. Their bond was unspoken but undeniable, built on years of companionship and shared understanding. In moments of silence, they would sit together and simply exist, the kind of quiet that spoke louder than words. Life continued like this for months. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: safety. The nightmares still came sometimes, fragments of the past that no amount of distance could erase, but they were manageable now, softened by the rhythm of everyday life and the presence of his dog. He felt that perhaps, finally, he had found a place where he could heal, a place where he could breathe without constantly being on alert. Then one morning, as the sun rose over the hills, a small incident began to unfold that would change everything. He took his dog out for the usual walk, the path through the forest quiet and serene. A neighbor had left their gate open, and a small child ran out chasing a ball. The dog, curious but well-trained, barked to alert him. It was a protective bark, not a threat, but someone passing by misinterpreted it. A call was made to law enforcement, and within minutes the calm of the morning began to crack. The officers arrived quickly, their presence tense and authoritative. They had no idea who they were dealing with. To them, this was just another routine call, another situation to control. They saw a dog barking and a man standing calmly by its side, and they misjudged the risk. The dog, sensing the tension and reacting instinctively to protect its owner, stood its ground. Its growl was low and controlled, a warning rather than an attack. But in the heat of the moment, no one could see the difference. Time seemed to stretch in those moments, each second carrying more weight than the last. He stood still, hands visible, voice calm as he tried to de-escalate the situation. His military training had taught him to read people, to assess threats, and to respond without panic. He understood the officers' fear, their need to assert control. He tried to communicate, to make them see that there was no danger, but fear has a way of clouding judgment, and the officers did not listen. And then, in a flash, it happened. A loud shot echoed through the quiet streets, cutting through the morning air like a blade. The dog collapsed, lifeless at his feet. The world seemed to stop. Neighbors froze, children screamed, and the officers looked on, stunned at what had just occurred. He knelt beside his companion, his hands shaking, heart pounding, but his face remained calm. Anger, grief, and disbelief surged inside him, but he did not scream or retaliate. Not yet. He looked into the eyes of the officers, and for a moment the full weight of who he was pressed down on them, even though they did not know it. He was a man who had survived the impossible, who had led teams through the most dangerous missions in the world, who had faced death more times than anyone should ever have to. And now, in his quiet town, in the light of a peaceful morning, he felt the sting of loss again. But this loss was different. It was personal, intimate, and it cut deeper than any mission could ever have. The officers tried to speak, their voices filled with excuses and attempts at justification. But their words were empty, meaningless against the grief and shock that consumed him. He had trusted them to be reasonable, to see reason, and they had failed. He had no weapon in his hand, no intention to retaliate in that moment, but the intensity of his gaze was enough to make anyone pause. There was a storm inside him, quiet but lethal, a reminder of the man he had been and the skills he still possessed. Neighbors gathered slowly, murmuring in confusion and fear. They had seen the dog, a harmless companion to the quiet man, fall in an instant, and they sensed the gravity of what had happened. They did not yet know his past, but they could feel the depth of his pain and the calm intensity with which he carried it. There was something about him that suggested he should not be underestimated, something in his posture, in the steadiness of his breathing, that hinted at untold strength. He stayed beside his dog for a long time, holding him, speaking softly, mourning in silence. He did not lash out, he did not cry loudly, but the sorrow in his eyes was raw and real. The dog had been more than a pet. It had been a piece of his soul, a connection to the simpler life he had finally found. And now it was gone, taken in a moment of fear and misunderstanding. As the officers retreated, unsure of how to handle the situation, he finally rose. His body was tense, his mind calculating, but his face remained composed. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be questions, investigations, and consequences. But he also knew that he had the power to control what came next. He had survived the impossible before, and he would face this new challenge with the same precision and determination. The quiet life he had built felt shattered, but he understood something important in that moment. His response, his choices and his actions would define the next chapter. The grief was heavy, but it was not the end. He would honor his dog, protect the memory of their bond, and navigate the world that had suddenly become uncertain once more. And deep down, he knew that the lessons from his past, discipline, patience, and restraint, would guide him through the storm ahead. He walked back home slowly, his steps deliberate, the empty leash in his hand a stark reminder of the loss he carried. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the street, but it could not touch the weight of what had happened. He would sit in his quiet house, remember his companion, and plan his next steps carefully. This was not just about grief. It was about justice, about ensuring that what happened could never happen again. As he entered his home, he looked around at the life he had built. It was still there, intact but fragile like a house built on sand. He knew that the calm he had found was delicate, and that the world could be unpredictable even in the quietest of towns. But he also knew that he had survived worse, that he had endured more than most could imagine, and that he would endure this too. He sat down, letting the silence settle around him, and allowed himself a single thought. His dog had been loyal to the end, and he would honor that loyalty with every choice he made from this day forward. The pain was real, the loss immense, but he was still standing. and standing was the first step toward moving forward, toward finding a way to live again even in the shadow of tragedy. The day started like any other, calm and quiet. The man stepped outside with his dog, leash in hand, feeling the cool morning air on his skin. The town was still waking up, birds chirping and a soft breeze brushing against the trees lining the streets. He breathed in deeply, feeling the familiar sense of calm that came from these simple routines. For a few moments everything felt right, as if the world outside had no claim over him. His dog walked close by his side, alert but relaxed, its ears occasionally flicking toward distant sounds, always watchful but never aggressive. It was during this peaceful morning walk that everything began to shift. A small incident occurred, one that seemed minor but would set off a chain of events that neither he nor anyone else could have foreseen. A neighbor's child had accidentally wandered onto the path, chasing a ball that had rolled away. The dog barked, a protective, not aggressive, a warning to the child to stay back. But the sound carried, loud and unfamiliar to anyone who didn't know the dog. A passerby, startled by the barking, pulled out a phone and made a call to law enforcement. The man didn't notice the call, focused instead on keeping the child safe and guiding the dog to stand down. Within minutes, the first officer arrived. The man could see the tension in the officer's posture before they even spoke. The officer's hand rested on a holster, the other gripping a radio, eyes scanning the surroundings as if danger lurked around every corner. The man remained calm, hands raised slightly in a non-threatening gesture. He had faced real danger before. Ambushes in the mountains, firefights in foreign deserts, and he understood the subtle cues of fear. He knew this officer was reacting out of caution, but caution mixed with fear could be deadly. The dog sensed it too. It stepped closer to the man, tail stiff, growling softly, a sound that was controlled and measured. It was a warning, not a threat. But the officer did not see it that way. The man tried to speak, his voice low and steady, explaining that the dog was friendly and trained, that there was no threat. He could see the doubt in the officer's eyes, the conflict between caution and reason. His words, calm and deliberate, should have diffused the situation, but fear has a way of clouding judgment. It was impossible to reason with someone who had already made up their mind that danger existed. A second officer arrived, their approach more rigid, their eyes scanning the street with suspicion. The man stayed still, careful not to make any sudden movements. He knew exactly how quickly situations could escalate, how small misunderstandings could turn into tragedy. Every muscle in his body was alert, every sense heightened. He studied the officers, their movements, their tone of voice, looking for any sign that the situation could be de-escalated. He knew that staying calm was his best weapon, that reacting emotionally could make everything worse. But in the midst of this careful negotiation, the unthinkable happened. The officers, misinterpreting the dog's protective stance as aggression, made a split-second decision. A shot rang out, sharp and violent, cutting through the morning air. The man's world seemed to tilt as if time itself had slowed. His dog, his companion and protector, collapsed to the ground, lifeless. He froze, shock rooting him to the spot. Every training he had received in the military, every moment of crisis he had survived, could not have prepared him for this. The sound of the gunshot echoed down the quiet streets, drawing neighbors out of their homes. Children stopped mid-play, parents froze on their porches, and the morning seemed to fall into a heavy silence. The man knelt beside his dog, hands trembling slightly as he tried to comprehend the loss. Grief and rage battled inside him, but he kept his face calm. Anger could wait. Right now he needed to think, to process, to survive the shock. The dog had been more than a companion. It had been his anchor, a piece of stability in a life that had often been chaotic and dangerous. The officers shouted, their voices attempting to justify their actions. They spoke of protocol, of fear, of the perceived threat. But their words were meaningless to the man. He could see clearly that their fear had overridden reason, that a life had been taken for no reason at all. He stayed still, letting the words wash over him, each one stoking the fire inside. He had faced enemies who had sought to kill him for power, for control, for greed, but this was different. This was an injustice rooted in ignorance and fear, and it felt personal. Neighbors began to gather, their murmurs a mixture of confusion and concern. They did not yet know who the man was, did not understand the life he had led or the skills he carried silently with him. All they could see was a man kneeling beside a fallen dog, a quiet but powerful figure surrounded by a tense scene. There was something about him that made people step back, a calm intensity that suggested he should not be provoked. He stayed with his dog for what felt like hours, although it had been only minutes. He whispered softly. Words meant more for himself than for the animal that no longer responded. Memories of all the quiet moments they had shared, the walks, the training sessions, the nights curled up together, surged through him. He had trusted this dog with his life, and now that trust had been shattered by a single moment of fear, his heart ached in a way that he had not allowed himself to feel for years. Finally, he rose, his hands steady now, his face composed. He understood that the next moments would define everything that followed. He would not act rashly, would not let grief cloud his judgment. He had survived the impossible before. He could survive this too, but he also knew that he could not let this act go unnoticed. His dog's life had been taken unfairly, and he would make sure that the truth was seen. He spoke to the officers calmly, his voice low but carrying authority. He asked questions, demanded clarity, and challenged their assumptions without raising his tone. The officers stumbled over their words, caught off guard by the man's calm and measured response. They had expected fear, anger, maybe even aggression, but not this quiet, controlled force. The man's military experience had taught him that control often carried more weight than force. That calmness could be more powerful than shouting. As the scene continued to unfold, neighbors whispered among themselves. They had never seen anything like it. A man who had clearly experienced trauma, pain, and danger, yet who maintained a composure that was almost unsettling. They watched as he documented everything, noting names, details, and events, making sure that the truth would be preserved. The dog may have been gone, but its memory and its sacrifice would not be ignored. The incident began to attract attention beyond the immediate neighborhood. News crews would later describe it as a tragic misunderstanding, a routine call gone wrong. But for the man, it was far more than that. It was a breach of trust, a moment that shattered the fragile sense of peace he had built. He realized that the life he had worked so hard to create, the quiet, measured life of calm and routine, could be disrupted in an instant. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him, but it also steeled him for the path ahead. He spent the rest of the day in a haze, moving through his home and neighborhood with a sense of detachment. Friends and neighbors offered comfort, though few understood the depth of his loss. He nodded politely, accepted their condolences, but inside he was planning, calculating, and processing. This was not the first time he had faced loss, and it would not be the last, but the way he responded now would set the tone for everything to come. As evening fell, he returned to the spot where his dog had fallen. He knelt once more, placing his hand gently on the soft fur, still warm from life that had been abruptly taken. Tears came unbidden, a release he had not allowed himself earlier. He spoke softly, recounting memories, expressing gratitude and mourning the companionship that had meant so much. In that quiet moment, he reaffirmed a silent promise that this loss would not define him, but it would guide him toward action, toward ensuring that such a mistake could not be repeated. The day ended with the sun setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the streets of the town. The man returned home, his mind heavy with grief but his spirit unbroken. He understood that the coming days would require patience, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to truth. The officers involved may have acted out of fear, but the man's response would be rooted in discipline, experience, and a steadfast sense of justice. He sat in his quiet house, the echoes of the day reverberating in his mind. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened. Children still played, neighbors went about their routines, and life carried on. But for him, the world had changed. The bond he had shared with his dog had been severed, and a new chapter of his life was beginning. One defined by grief, resilience, and a determination to see justice done. He knew that nothing would bring his dog back, but he also knew that honoring its memory meant standing firm, speaking out, and navigating the challenges ahead with the same precision and care that had guided him through his past missions. The grief he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He had faced death countless times, had seen friends and comrades fall in missions across the world, but the loss of his dog struck a place in his heart that nothing else could touch. This was not a fleeting sadness. It was a deep, consuming ache, a reminder that even those who survive war are not immune to loss in the most personal and intimate ways. He moved through the day as if in a fog, every corner of his home filled with memories of the dog, every quiet sound a reminder of what had been taken from him. He sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where his dog had always waited. The silence was deafening. He could almost hear the soft panting, the gentle scratching of paws on the floor, the excited greeting that had become a ritual every time he returned home. Every memory played like a film in his mind, unspooling with vivid clarity. He remembered the first day he brought the dog home, how it had tilted its head curiously, sniffed his boots, and then, almost immediately, accepted him as its companion. From that day they had been inseparable, a team that understood each other without words. He could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, but he kept it contained, disciplined. His military training had taught him the importance of control, of using emotion strategically rather than letting it dictate actions. But this was different. This was not a mission or a battlefield. It was life, raw and unfair, and no amount of training could erase the pain. He could see clearly how the situation had escalated, how fear and misunderstanding had led to tragedy. The officers had acted out of instinct, but their instinct had been fatal, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily on him. He remembered the officer who had fired, the look in their eyes, the hesitation that had come too late. It was a look he had seen before, fear mixed with a lack of experience, a rush to action without understanding. In the military, misjudgment could cost lives, but there was always training, always communication. Here, there had been none of that, and the result was irreversible. The thought gnawed at him, and he found himself replaying the moment over and over, imagining how things might have been different, wondering if there was something he could have done to prevent it. Despite the pain, he refused to succumb to despair. He moved methodically, checking the area where the dog had fallen, speaking with neighbors who had witnessed the event. He listened, he took notes, he documented everything. Every detail mattered. The time, the distance, the positions of the officers, the behavior of the dog. This was not just grief, it was preparation. He knew that in order to seek justice, he needed clarity, precision, and evidence. He approached it as he would any mission, with focus and determination. But the human side of his response, the heartbreak, the sorrow, the rage, remained raw and close to the surface. People began to notice a change in him. The quiet man who had once kept to himself now moved with purpose, a subtle intensity that made neighbors step back. He spoke less, observed more, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. There was no shouting, no threats, but an unmistakable authority in his tone that commanded attention. It was the same authority he had used on the battlefield, the same discipline that had earned him respect and loyalty from his team. But now it was tempered with sorrow, a quiet power fueled by loss and a desire for accountability. He took long walks in the evenings, retracing the path where the incident had occurred. The trees and streets that had once been comforting now felt different, marked by the memory of the day. He thought about the dog, about the loyalty and trust that had been shared between them. He remembered the moments of joy, the playful runs in the yard, the nights when the dog had nuzzled close, providing warmth and comfort in the silence of the night. Each memory was bittersweet, a mixture of happiness and grief that made the loss feel even more acute. He began to reach out, quietly at first, to those who could help. Lawyers, animal rights advocates, and even former colleagues who understood the nuances of control and authority. He asked questions, sought advice, and began to build a picture of how he could respond. He was not seeking revenge. He was seeking justice. There was a distinction he understood deeply. Revenge would satisfy anger but accomplish nothing. Justice required patience, strategy, and the willingness to endure the frustration of bureaucracy and misunderstanding. As the days passed, he continued to live in his home, performing his routines with deliberate care. He tended his garden, prepared meals, and maintained the quiet discipline that had always been his anchor. But underneath there was a storm, a tension that could not be ignored. Every sound outside his home, every movement in the street reminded him of the fragility of peace and the suddenness with which life could change. He had faced ambushes and surprise attacks before, but this was different. This was personal. This was a violation of the bond he had shared with his dog, a betrayal of trust that cut deeply. One evening he sat on the porch, the sky painted with the colors of sunset. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, thinking about all he had survived and all he had lost. He thought about the missions, the danger, and the comrades he had lost along the way. And now, a companion he had chosen for love and loyalty had been taken. The comparison was stark, and the grief felt heavier because it was not abstract. It was immediate, intimate, and undeniably personal. Yet he remained composed. He understood that the world would continue moving, that the officers would return to their routines, and that the town would forget in time. But he would not forget. He would carry the memory of his dog forward, using it as a guide for his next steps. He began to plan methodically, thinking through every possible scenario, considering the reactions of those involved, and preparing for the inevitable obstacles that would arise. Discipline, patience, and strategy, lessons from the past, became his tools for navigating this personal battlefield. He spent hours each day writing, documenting his thoughts, his grief, and the facts of the incident. This was both a coping mechanism and a form of preparation. He knew that clarity of mind would be essential if he were to seek any form of accountability. Each word he wrote was deliberate, each memory recorded with precision. The act of writing allowed him to process the grief, to channel the anger into something productive, and to maintain control over a situation that had been violently disrupted. Occasionally, neighbors would approach, offering words of comfort or questions about what had happened. He responded politely with calm explanations, never letting emotions cloud his interactions. But behind the composure, the intensity of his experience was palpable. They could sense it in his eyes, in the measured way he moved, in the quiet power that seemed to radiate from him. There was a presence about him that demanded respect, a subtle warning that he should not be underestimated. Nighttime brought its own challenges. Sleep was elusive, filled with memories and flashes of the dog, of the incident, and of the unspoken injustice. He would wake frequently, reaching instinctively for a companion that was no longer there. The absence was tangible, a hollow space that could not be filled. He allowed himself to grieve, but always with a controlled edge, understanding that his response would define what came next. He could not afford to let grief become paralysis. He had to transform it into purpose. He began to envision the steps he would take. First, the documentation, the collection of evidence, the verification of every detail. Then, the outreach to those who could influence the situation, to those who could ensure accountability without resorting to retaliation. He thought about the officers, their training, and their mistakes, considering how fear and misunderstanding had led to tragedy. Each step was weighed carefully, each decision calculated with precision. This was not the battlefield, but it required the same strategic mind, the same focus and discipline, and the same understanding of human behavior. He also thought about the memory of his dog, about the bond that had been unshakable. That memory became both shield and motivation. It reminded him of loyalty, trust, and love, things that had been taken but could also guide him forward. He promised himself that the dog's life, though brief in this world, would not be forgotten. Its death would become a symbol of justice and awareness, a catalyst for ensuring that similar mistakes could not happen to anyone else. Days turned into weeks, and he continued his routines with relentless precision. He walked the streets, observed the town, and maintained the discipline that had always defined him. But the fire inside him, the quiet storm of grief and determination, continued to grow. Every step he took was a preparation, every interaction a test, every quiet moment a rehearsal for the challenges ahead. He was a man transformed by loss, yet strengthened by the clarity it brought. He understood that he could not rush, that justice required patience, strategy, and endurance. The officers had acted out of fear, but he would act out of precision, using the tools of his past, observation, discipline, and calculated action, to navigate this new mission. His dog had been more than a companion. It had been a part of him, a reflection of loyalty and trust. And now that reflection demanded honor, demanded action, and demanded that the world recognize the depth of what had been lost. He spent evenings in quiet contemplation, sometimes speaking aloud to the empty room, sometimes simply sitting in the darkness. He thought about courage, responsibility, and the consequences of action and inaction. He understood the delicate balance of power, fear, and respect that governed human behavior, and he knew that he had to navigate that balance carefully if he was to achieve the outcome he sought. Through it all, he remained remarkably composed to outsiders. To them he was a grieving man, quiet, respectful, and controlled. But beneath that exterior, the intensity of his experience, the depth of his loss, and the focus of his purpose were undeniable. He had survived impossible missions, and he would survive this personal tragedy with the same unwavering determination. Grief had become his guide, and justice his goal, and he was ready to move forward with both clarity and resolve. The days following the incident carried a weight that seemed impossible to shake. He continued his routines, tending to the garden, walking through the quiet streets, and documenting every detail of what had happened. Yet there was an undercurrent now, a sense that the world around him was shifting, that his grief and determination were beginning to ripple outward. Neighbors whispered, small questions and murmurs spread, and the incident that had seemed local and contained was growing into something larger, something that demanded attention. It began with the press. Local reporters arrived, drawn to the story of a man whose dog had been shot by law enforcement during a routine call. They framed it as a tragic misunderstanding, focusing on the fear, the quick reactions, and the innocent loss. He allowed them to observe and ask questions, careful not to appear emotional or reactive. The calmness he displayed was intentional, a shield and a statement. He understood the power of perception, the influence of how others interpreted his response. The world often misjudged strength, mistaking anger for power and composure for weakness. The truth, however, was far more complex. His life, hidden beneath the quiet exterior, had been extraordinary. He had served in one of the most elite military units in the world, leading missions that had required extreme courage, intelligence, and leadership. He had been at the forefront of operations that were secret, dangerous, and decisive. Few could imagine the weight of responsibility he had carried, the decisions that had determined life or death for both his team and countless others. He had returned to civilian life seeking peace, yet the loss of his dog threatened to ignite that old storm once more. Word of his background eventually reached the authorities. Once the local police department learned that the man they had encountered was a retired Delta Force commander, a sense of urgency and unease spread through the ranks. It was no longer a simple case of a routine call gone wrong. This was a man trained to endure, to survive, and to act with precision under pressure. His reputation alone carried weight, and the implications of how the incident had been handled now seemed far more serious. Government officials quietly began to monitor the situation. They understood that the man's experience, while hidden from most, meant he was capable of ensuring the world noticed this injustice. They also realized that mishandling the aftermath could escalate a local incident into a national matter. Quiet inquiries were made, officers involved were questioned, and statements were reviewed. The calm man who had lost his dog was no longer just a civilian. He was someone who had operated in high-stakes environments where mistakes could be fatal, and they now understood the gravity of underestimating him. He continued to move with deliberate caution. He did not seek confrontation. He sought clarity and accountability. He allowed reporters to capture his side, carefully presenting the facts, the sequence of events, and the context that had led to his dog's death. His narrative was calm, measured, and undeniably credible. People began to listen. His story, the quiet dignity with which he carried his grief, resonated deeply. It was not about vengeance. It was about truth and the unfairness of a life taken without cause. As his identity became known publicly, the tone of the coverage shifted. He was no longer just a man mourning a dog. He was a decorated military veteran, a commander whose leadership had shaped countless operations. Suddenly, the story was about accountability at every level. Officers involved were scrutinized more carefully, and the public began to understand the depth of the error that had occurred. The simple act of a dog's life being taken revealed larger questions about training, judgment, and fear within law enforcement. Despite the attention, he remained composed. He did not relish the publicity, but he recognized its power. His calm, disciplined presence drew attention to the injustice without sensationalism. He spoke plainly, emphasizing fairness, responsibility, and the lessons to be learned. There was no dramatic outburst, no theatrical displays of grief or anger. His demeanor was a reflection of his past, where control and clarity often made the difference between survival and disaster. He met with investigators and legal advisors, sharing his detailed documentation, explaining every nuance of the event. and highlighting the discrepancies in the officers' accounts. He knew that the truth alone was a powerful tool. He did not exaggerate. He did not embellish. He presented facts, evidence, and personal testimony, all rooted in the careful observation he had honed over a lifetime of missions. Each interaction was deliberate, each question anticipated, each statement measured. He was not just a victim. He was a strategist, applying lessons from his military experience to navigate this new battlefield. The officers involved began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The initial fear that had prompted the shooting now returned, not as instinct but as an awareness of accountability. Their previous actions, once justified in the heat of the moment, were now under scrutiny in a way that they had not anticipated. The presence of a highly trained, disciplined veteran who had lost his companion without reason changed the dynamic entirely. They realized too late that they had underestimated him, and that underestimation carried consequences. Community reactions were varied. Some expressed outrage, others disbelief, but many were drawn to the story because of the man's calm strength, his insistence on fairness, and the humanity of his response. He became a quiet symbol of resilience, someone who had endured incredible loss and yet chose to pursue justice without resorting to violence. People began to understand the depth of the connection between humans and animals, the loyalty and love that had been brutally interrupted, and the need for accountability in a system that often acted too quickly and without full understanding. Despite the external focus, he continued to grieve privately. Nights were long and filled with memories. He walked through the empty streets in the dark, speaking softly to himself, recounting moments shared with his dog. These walks were both ritual and meditation, a way to process the loss, to remember the companionship, and to prepare for the public attention he now faced. The grief never fully left, but he learned to carry it with grace, transforming it into a force for action rather than a source of despair. His interactions with the authorities were strategic. He met with them calmly, providing clear timelines, descriptions, and evidence that challenged the initial narrative. He did not threaten, he did not intimidate, but the weight of his presence and reputation was unmistakable. He knew that the officers had acted without understanding, but he also knew that escalation was dangerous. Control was essential, and he exercised it with precision. Each conversation was measured, each question answered thoughtfully, each action intentional. As the public story grew, he became more aware of the responsibility he now carried. He was no longer just seeking justice for his dog. He was raising awareness of systemic issues that had led to the tragedy. His calm, deliberate approach highlighted the importance of training, awareness, and humaneness in law enforcement interactions. He did not seek to demonize anyone. He sought to ensure that mistakes of fear and misunderstanding would be less likely to occur in the future. His focus was on accountability and improvement, grounded in his own loss and his own experience. In private moments, he reflected on his life and the path that had led him here. He remembered missions, comrades, and moments of both triumph and failure. He compared those experiences with the current challenge, recognizing similarities in strategy, patience, and observation. The skills he had developed over decades of service were now being applied to a personal mission, one that required both intellect and emotional control. Every choice he made was influenced by his training, his experience, and his unshakable commitment to truth. Slowly, the officers began to cooperate more fully. Statements were reviewed, inconsistencies noted, and internal investigations expanded. The realization that they had engaged with a highly skilled, highly disciplined individual who demanded accountability changed their approach. They began to understand that fear-driven actions had consequences, and that recklessness, even in the name of protocol, could not be ignored. He did not celebrate this realization. He remained calm, focused, and resolute. The goal was justice, not personal satisfaction. Throughout all this, he remained engaged with the community. Neighbors, friends, and supporters recognized his calm authority and the depth of his loss. They offered support, but more importantly, they listened. He spoke about responsibility, about loss, and about the ways humans could ensure that loyalty, trust, and life were respected. His words carried weight because they were rooted in experience, in personal tragedy, and in the calm strength of someone who had faced unimaginable challenges and survived. The story began to spread beyond the town, reaching state and even national attention. People were drawn to the narrative of a man whose life had been shaped by extraordinary service, and who had responded to personal tragedy with dignity and strategy. The focus shifted from a local incident to a broader conversation about accountability, training, and human response. His calm, measured presence in public statements, interviews, and discussions became the defining element of the story. The public understood that this was no ordinary dispute. It was a lesson in restraint, awareness, and justice. In private, he continued his mourning. He visited the spot where his dog had fallen, leaving small tokens of remembrance, speaking softly, and reflecting on the loyalty and trust that had defined their relationship. These private rituals strengthened his resolve, reminding him of the importance of honoring memory through action rather than anger. Each visit reinforced his commitment to clarity, strategy, and justice, shaping the way he engaged with authorities, the public, and the unfolding situation. He also began to consider the broader implications of the incident. How could similar tragedies be prevented? What policies needed change? How could training address both fear and responsibility? He approached these questions methodically, drawing on his military experience, his personal loss, and his understanding of human behavior. His insights were not theoretical. They were informed by lived experience, by the discipline of leadership, and by a deep commitment to fairness. He communicated these ideas calmly and clearly, both publicly and privately, influencing the discussions that were now emerging around the incident. Even as the external pressure grew, he maintained his routines. Gardening, long walks, and quiet evenings became anchors, grounding him in a life that was now irrevocably changed. The community watched, sometimes in awe, sometimes in quiet reflection, as a man transformed by grief navigated the complexities of justice with calm determination. He did not seek to dominate, to intimidate, or to retaliate. His presence alone conveyed the seriousness of his intentions, the depth of his loss, and the unwavering strength that lay beneath his calm exterior. As the weeks passed, a shift became apparent. The officers were under closer scrutiny, the community more aware of the nuances of fear, training, and responsibility, and the broader public beginning to engage with questions of accountability and justice. He had not demanded recognition, but it had arrived because of the undeniable clarity and integrity of his approach. The narrative was no longer about a simple mistake. It was about human response, oversight, and the need for thoughtful, measured action. Through it all, he remained a man defined by both discipline and humanity. The loss of his dog had been devastating, but it had also revealed the strength, clarity, and calm that had always been within him. He had turned grief into action, personal tragedy into a catalyst for awareness, and silent loss into a message that resonated far beyond his quiet town. The world now knew, at least in part, the depth of his experience, the precision of his character, and the unwavering commitment to justice that guided his every choice.